It's a real pleasure to meet you and speak with you. I've read your books and I've been a fan for many years. The first question I want to ask is the context and the climate today for the thinking Christian. It can be challenging because the assumption by many people, it's not are you right or wrong, it's are you clever or stupid, and Christians can't be clever. To believe in all of that means they're not clever. Now obviously you and others prove that wrong, but I think that is the underlying premise of many in the public square today.
Oh, it is indeed, because they have redefined faith to be a religious term, meaning you believe without any evidence.
Yeah.
And of course that, as a presupposition, makes it very difficult to prove that you're actually sitting on the other side.
Right.
But of course it's ridiculous. The simplest historical investigation will show that in the 16th and 17th centuries, for instance, it was faith in God that was the motor that drove the rise of science, the rise of modern science, and people like Galileo and Kepler, Newton and so on. So they certainly didn't see any contradiction. And it amuses me slightly because here I sit at the University of Oxford, whose motto is Dominus Illuminatio Mea, the Lord is my light. And the people that founded our great universities were deep thinkers. And at the same time they believed in God. They didn't feel any tension.
So when did this happen? Because we think of the Catholic Church being in many ways the handmaiden of science and intellectual development. Then with the Reformation, and particularly the Puritans, the Calvinists, Milton and the foundation of Harvard. So certainly into the 18th century, the 19th I would argue, intellect and Christianity went hand in hand. But then it began to change, didn't it? Then the attitude was transformed.
Partly, I suspect, due to forces operating during the Enlightenment, particularly in France perhaps, where there was a fairly strong reaction to a corrupt clerisy and church hierarchy and all this kind of thing. And the pressure to enthrone reason. Also, you get the machinations of people like Thomas Henry Huxley and so on, who was incensed at the idea of these amateur scientists who were at the same time clerics and theologians, and he wanted to establish the hegemony of science. And the famous debate between Huxley and Wilberforce in 1860 in the Natural History Museum in Oxford was one of those iconic things which has been massively misinterpreted, but used to project a strong feeling that atheism is on the side of science and that's the rational way to go. And that still barrels up into the 21st century for us today, I think.
Very much. And the Church of England really is responsible for encouraging ideas of evolution to be discussed in the public square. I mean, Huxley didn't speak for all Christians, but certainly, and I take it a bit further, even the debates of the 1920s and 1930s were very civil. If it was George Bernard Shaw and G.K. Chesterton, they were civil, they liked each other. When did the so-called new atheism, I think that's a misnomer, it's a very old atheism, but when did it start to become, as it so often is, rather rude and aggressive?
Well, if you ask them, there was an article in Der Spiegel just a few years ago where Dawkins was quoted as saying 9/11 radicalized him. And then you get this simplistic logic. 9/11 was religion. It's unacceptable. And if you argue that it's extremist, the answer is, well, extremist religion thrives in the periphery of moderate religion, so we get rid of all religion. And that's where the shrill voices started. You know, Steven Weinberg, who is a very distinguished Nobel Prize winner in physics, saying the best thing we scientists can do this generation is to eliminate religion. And anything we do should be done, which sounds sinisterly totalitarian. I think that's where the shrillness certainly started on their account, and I suspect there's a lot of truth in that.
It's always struck me as being so banal, the idea that if one religion is bad, all religions are bad. If we applied that to politics, fascism is bad, thus all politics have to be bad. Well, no comparison.
Well, some of them have seen that. Sam Harris saw through that, actually. You know, a kind of matrix that puts the Amish in with Islamic extremists is not very useful. And Dawkins has indeed retracted from that, saying he doesn't know of too many Christians who are bombing cathedrals and so on and so forth. And it's a bit sad because it airbrushes out very effectively the history of the 20th century in terms of the secular regimes that were very violent, like Stalin, Pol Pot, and so on. And atheism had a great deal to do with that. Peace be to their feeling it hadn't. They clearly haven't read much Marx, if that's the way they think.
Yeah. And this old canard, but an understandable one. Bad things happening to good people. Some people on the fringe of Christendom have made it worse because they've argued that if you believe that the world will be fine, you'll even make money, and I find that very, very insulting.
Oh, sure.
But of course we were never guaranteed a good life we were guaranteed a perfect eternity, but we aren't guaranteed a good life.
No, we're not. But I see it as more than a canard. I see it as one of the major reasons why many of my colleagues will not believe in a personal God, because of the problem of suffering and evil. And I think in a way it's a hard problem, and one needs to take time unpacking it. But my short answer to it is atheism doesn't solve it. My atheist friends think, well, that's just the way the universe is and we have to accept it. But of course the suffering and the pain remains. But what they've lost is all hope.
Yes.
And I point out to them that the Christian view is that God, there is a real way into this. I wouldn't call it an answer because that sounds too arrogant and far too simplistic. But the cross at the heart of Christianity, at the very least, if Christianity's central claim is true, that Jesus is God incarnate, then we've God on a cross, putting it crudely. And we ask, why is that? And the immediate obvious thing is God hasn't remained distant from this problem, but has become part of it. And then the second bit is that the resurrection of Christ was preached initially as evidence there was to be a judgment, a final moral assessment, which means that our consciences, which scream for justice, particularly in Auschwitz, are not an illusion, and fair judgment's going to be done. Whereas on the hypothesis of atheism, as I put to Dawkins directly, he said, but look, I fight for justice in this world. I said, so do I. But Richard, there's no ultimate justice. And the vast multi-billions of people who've ever lived will never get justice in this world. And on your hypothesis, there is no next world, so they'll never ever get justice. But for the Christian, they will, because God is utterly fair and his assessment will be utterly righteous. So although I have a problem, if you like, I can see a way to a solution that millions of people have found, at least gives them a window. There are lots of unanswered questions. Often I put it as a bottom line. I said, look, all the philosophical arguments are unsatisfactory. Surely a good God could, would, might, and so on. And the reason we find them unsatisfactory is we're faced with the fact that we've got two things as we look at the world: barbed wire and beauty. And so we have to ask another question. Is there any evidence anywhere that there's a God that we can trust with that? And I think there is.
Yeah, barbed wire and beauty. The juxtaposition is wonderful. I'll probably use and steal that, by the way. If someone responded though by saying, well, yes, the possibility, even the probability of justice afterwards, but isn't that just an excuse, not an argument, an excuse for those who are too weak to face the harsh reality of life?
The Freudian argument backfires because it's like a boomerang. Because, as has been pointed out recently and most brilliantly, I think, by one of Germany's leading psychiatrists, Manfred Lutz, in his book, he says, well, of course, if there's no God, that argument works, that Christianity is a wish fulfillment, and so on, if there's no God. But of course, if there is a God, the very same argument shows you that atheism is the delusion, the hope that we never have to face God with all the mess up we've made of our lives and other people's lives. And then he gives the bottom line, which I think is very important. On the substantive question, whether there's a God or not, neither Freud, Jung, or Frankl can help you. You have to look elsewhere. So it's a smokescreen that works both ways.
Yeah. And Frankl, of course, didn't deny God, and he said
no, Frankl didn't.
Some of the people in the camps who were the most resilient and loving and good were people who had faith.
Yes, that's correct. It's most interesting, you know. I was at 9/11 2 years ago. I was at Ground Zero. And I was invited at very short notice to give a talk on this topic on the steps of Columbia University in the open air. It was very moving on the evening of 9/11. So I decided to go and listen to the reading of the names. And what was so fascinating was there wasn't a single, in all the hours of reading those names, a single expression of atheism. There were many expressions of trust in God, and indeed some of the most moving things were people speaking as if their dead relatives were still alive. Happy birthday, Dad, and so on, that kind of thing. I found it very moving. But it was striking. No atheism, but many, many assertions of faith in God in spite of the devastation of 9/11.
And ultimately, there is no absolute proof. There cannot be, there shouldn't be, because if there is, then but by pure self-interest, everybody would be a Christian, and that's not God's plan. It's not winning. You don't agree?
Well, what I would say is it's an ambiguous use of the word proof.
Right.
Because I'm a pure mathematician,
Yeah.
and rigorous proof of the kind that people are normally thinking of when they make that point, you don't get anywhere except in pure mathematics.
Right.
But in other, so I don't use the word proof, I use evidence, pointers, and all this kind of thing, which doesn't mean it's weak. For instance, I can't prove mathematically that my wife loves me, but 46 years of marriage mean that I would stake my life on that. You see, so I think it's misleading because it's a use of the word proof, and people tend to confuse it with the mathematical one.
Right. I'm going to get a telephone and speak to your wife and find out, by the way. That'll be my proof.
Oh, you can do that. Yes. That's right. Well, you're right to ask for evidence. That's the right attitude.
Exactly. Dr. Lennox, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.